Good day, everybody, and thank you for joining us again for another U3A session. Dr. Robin Lee has researched the history of Hermanus extensively, and he's also concentrated on some of the interesting personalities that have had their connections with Hermanus. Today, he'll be talking to us about another one of those personalities, Sir William Hoy, who played a major role in the country, particularly as far as the South African railways are concerned, as we'll learn more, and had a special connection with Hermanus, which he will also be telling us about. Robin, thank you very much. Thank you for all your research. Your presentations are always very well researched, and we're certainly looking forward to today's as well.
The first slide shows two aspects of Sir William Hoy. I'll call him Sir William throughout, although it wasn't until 1919 that he was actually knighted after he'd been in South Africa for about 30 years. But it's more convenient to call him Sir William throughout. On the left of the slide is a house which he used in Parktown, Johannesburg, when he was general manager of the South African Railways and Harbours. The house has recently been restored, and this is exactly what it looked like at the time that Sir William and his family would be staying there. So that's a sort of image of a relatively luxurious, upper middle class general manager of the railways. On the right is a cartoon from one of the early Cape papers, which the title of which is Railway Colossus, and it shows Hoy with his one foot firmly in the Cape Colony and his other foot firmly in the Transvaal, launching South African Railways in 1910. And that's again the public figure, the person who was very highly regarded in political and economic circles. The next slide shows him in a more personal mode. Now you'll notice well-dressed. He wasn't always well-dressed on his fishing expeditions, as you'll see in a moment. But this photograph, although it's not captioned anywhere, I estimate to be about 1902 or 1903. A very dapper business person shown there. I've decided to show his whole CV to you at once. It's the next two slides. So you get some idea of his relatively rapid rise to influence in South Africa. He was born in Scotland and he left school at the 14 years of age and became a clerk in the railways. So he in fact spent his entire life working for one or other railways. In 1888, the Cape Government Railways, quite recently established, recruited him. And among his early tasks, he was put to work on heading up teams that had to repair bridges that had been destroyed by the Boer forces during the war. And he really made his name there with the rapidity and the excellence with which he repaired these war damages. So immediately after the war in 1903, he was appointed as general manager of the Cape Government Railways. At that stage, each of the separate territories, colonies or territories, had individual railways: Natal, the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and the Cape Government Railways. But after 1910, he was appointed general manager of the railway system for the entire country and given the task of reorganizing the 4 provincial railways into a single national system. He had barely got through that task when South Africa entered the First World War on the side of Britain and her allies, and was asked by Britain to invade German Southwest Africa and destroy the military installations, especially wireless installations along the coast. He was in charge of building the railway, which made that possible. More information about that later. By 1919, he had become so prominent nationally and politically that Louis Botha and Smuts invited him to join the team that went to the signing of the peace treaty for World War I, and he was present at the various ceremonies that took place. Because of his work in the German Southwest Africa, he was knighted in 1919. Interestingly enough, he was the last South African to be knighted. In 1924, the Herzog government introduced legislation making it impossible for South African citizens to be knighted. So he was the last knight. In 22, he worked with Smuts in putting down the armed miners' strike. I'll talk more about that later. In 23, he represented the railways in constructing the first electricity generating station for the railways near Durban. In 1926-7, he worked with Stevenson Hamilton to protect the Kruger Park, and I'll talk more about that. Unfortunately, I think for the country, he died relatively young. He was only 62 when he died of cancer of the throat. So that gives you a thumbnail sketch of a life full of achievement and, interestingly enough, virtually no failures. In fact, I've been unable to find a project in which he was involved which was a failure. His connection with Hermanus is very early, about 1904, and very close. He returned repeatedly. No one can even give the number of times he returned on holiday. And this was his favorite hotel, the Marine. In this image is about 1920. It's a little later than he started coming to Hermanus, but he always stayed at the Marine. He never resorted to buying a house here. And this was his favorite pastime, fishing. The fish that you see at the front of the base of the picture represent one day's catch off Hermanus in about 1910. There are some quite interesting characters. Obviously, this is Hoy himself, looking a bit more rumpled than he did in the earlier picture. This is Lady Hoy. He had the good sense to marry his boss's daughter when he was joined the railways. This is the Hoy's adopted daughter, Maudie. And this gentleman here is Dani Woensdrecht, one of the prominent citizens of Hermanus at that time, who always worked with Hoy when he came for his fishing expeditions. He was renowned in the town for having an attitude that was free of the class prejudice of the time. This little extract is taken from Treadgold's book, Village of the Sea, and seems to come straight from Dani Woensdrecht himself. At the end of a fishing trip, they decided to stay over and start early the next day. So when they looked into this accommodation at the Marine, the only other sleeping place available was half the bed Sir William had been given. Dani must come and share it with him. Dani demurred. I told him I hadn't brought my pajamas with me. That doesn't matter, Sir William said. You can have mine, and I'll sleep as I am. I didn't sleep very well, Dani confessed. I was too embarrassed. Of course, if Sir William made a practice of sleeping in his suit, no wonder it was rumpled, as we saw in the previous picture. This was the sort of train that was running about the time that he would have arrived in the Cape. And he saw the locomotives go through amazing changes in the time that he was involved with the railways. Here was really a massive development between the 1860s and 70s and 1902. And by the time that he left the railways shortly before his death, this was the nature of the locomotives that he was dealing with. And he kept up with all the technological development, and in fact wrote several articles about the technological development of locomotives. Now I want to try and answer the perennial question, did Hoy really stop the railway reaching Hermanus to keep the village atmosphere? And so you don't become overcome with excitement. Here is the answer. No, it was part of his national strategy to combine rail and road. The road service of the SARNH was only discontinued, he established it, was only discontinued in 1976. He went completely differently to both the UK and the USA in establishing a rail network. He designated a significant number of larger towns as rail heads, and then from each railhead, instead of building another line, he laid on lorries or buses to carry goods and passengers from the railhead to the smaller towns. And that was the strategy he applied to Hermanus. He did like Hermanus, but my scrutiny of the documents convinces me that he didn't stop the railway in order that the village didn't change. He never contemplated a railway to Hermanus. He always saw the railway going to a railhead at Bot River and a lorry service from Bot River to Hermanus. So in 1912, he established the railway bus service. This is the first bus that was used. You can notice that it has solid tires, so it's a very early model. And this is the first driver employed. And the trip to Bot River took most of the day, and if the rivers were in flood, could last a fortnight. So you try to pick your time as you left Hermanus. Later, they established the first bus station. This was in Market Square, and the buildings that you see behind the two buses are roughly where Wimpy's is now on Market Square, the corner of Market Square and Main Road. And you can see passengers, and they took freight as well. This is an image that I obtained from the Transnet Museum. They claim it was one of the early railway buses used in Hermanus, but I've been unable to verify that. It looks more luxurious than the other ones that we have seen. But the bus service was up and running by 1912. The second station was in Main Road, opposite where Neil du Toit's shop is now. And you can see that by the fact that the pavement rises several centimeters at that point. This was to enable the passengers to get into the bus from the pavement. The original pavement was too low for them to board the bus. And that pavement has never been altered. You can go and look at it now. And that remained the station from about 1930 to 1944, when this building was opened. I know from a variety of sources that this building was never intended as a railway station. It was always intended as a bus station. And it's only later legend that has maintained that this was built and then they forgot or didn't build the railway. Some person who believed these legends erected that sign, Hermanus Station, which is not inaccurate, but it should say Hermanus Bus Station. Incidentally, this was opened by Louis Esselin, who was the deputy premier of South Africa under Smuts in 1944. Hoy continued to be interested in the connection between rail and road and put quite a lot of money into this contraption. It's a railroad vehicle. As you can see, the rail wheels are here in front, and you would go as far as the rails went, and then you could move off the rails and proceed on solid tires to your destination. This is Sir William himself experimenting with this near Hermanus. I've never been able to identify the exact place, but they experimented for quite some time. A man called Dutton, later Sir Frank Dutton, invented this vehicle, but it was always unlikely to succeed. Here is an image which comes from one of the sources of Hoy's personal images. This is taken in 1915 when he was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the South African Army and seconded to build a railway from Uppington to Prieska. Lady Hoy sitting there, of course, and the daughter Maudie as before. This is probably taken in the garden of the house I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, which has the name Wanuka. In 1914, as I mentioned, South Africa went to war with Germany in support of Britain and the other allies, and Hoy personally supervised the building of the railway from this point to that point. And it was, at the time, the second biggest railway construction project in the world and completed in the shortest time. They built 272 kilometers of rail in 82 days. And most of this was due to the ingenuity that Hoy displayed in overcoming problems. One of the first problems was the Orange River. It's hard to believe, but after a couple of months of using pontoons to take the locomotives across the river, he succeeded in building a wooden bridge across the Orange River. So later trains were able to make their own way over the bridges. But you can see there's a lot of Heath Robinson appearance about this, but needless to say, it worked. Once over the river, the railway took this form, elevated rail track when required, but on other occasions, he innovated to the point where on flat, hard soil, he laid the rails directly on the soil without any base or any sleepers, and succeeded in doing it to the point where the trains could in fact pass by without the usual bed that the rails provide. But on the other hand, they still had to use camels for some of the trip. Very interesting photograph, this, probably the only photograph that exists of South African soldiers on camels. He also invented a lighting device, which you see here. And one of the train engines, he fitted a boom, as you see there, and with electricity generated by the engine, he managed to bring a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 floodlights into existence. This enabled his workers to work in 3 8-hour shifts, so that the track was built with workers while work was going on for 24 hours a day for the 82 days that they took to build the road. And it was in recognition of this work that he was finally knighted by the King, Edward. 1919 was a good year for him. As I mentioned, he was knighted and he attended the peace conference at Versailles. This is the main hall of the Versailles conference. I've looked for him, but unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have faced a camera at this moment. He came back and continued to work on developing the railway until Smuts called him back into the cabinet and into work for the Rand Miners' Rebellion of 1922. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the circumstances, but this cartoon from a Cape Town Afrikaans paper of 1922 shows the origin of the strike, that the railways under Hoy were rumoured to be dismissing white employees in order to employ black employees. And this led to the Rand Rebellion, which I'm sure you know was a heavily armed rebellion The miners took over large chunks of Johannesburg, including Fordsburg, where they had their headquarters. These buildings here are the headquarters of the miners' rebellion, and these are defensive trenches that they've dug. Smuts was in charge at this time, and he was totally ruthless in suppressing the rebellion, partly because he thought it wasn't justified, and partly because he saw it as the first entrance of communism into South Africa, and that it had to be stopped right there and then. He utilized the Air Force and the tank brigades to put down the rebellion, and Hoy was responsible for moving these from their coastal bases to Johannesburg to be used in putting down the rebellion. In 1925, he was sufficiently well known to meet with the Prince of Wales. You probably recognize the face. He later became Edward VIII and then abdicated. And so he was now moving in quite exalted circumstances by this time of his career. His wife, Lady Hoy, I've only been able to place this to the mid-1920s. In 1926, he first made contact with Colonel James Stevenson Hamilton, who was the first steward of the Kruger National Park. That's a typical photograph of him. He spent most of his time in the bush, if he could, and attended meetings only when he had to. The establishment of the park was a highly controversial step. And there were many farmers in the area who strongly resisted the creation of a national park and strongly resisted legislation which forbade them to shoot game on their own farms, so that this could be incorporated in, the game could be incorporated in the national park. Hoy, who had a keen sense of the industry we call tourism, threw himself behind the park and entered into an arrangement with Stevenson Hamilton by which the railways would provide half of all publicity expenses, and the park had to only pay the other half. And Hoy launched through the railways a very successful publicity campaign. Its most famous image is this one here, urging people to visit the national park. Hoy engaged the services of an artist called Stuart Caldecott, and he designed dozens of photographs on this theme, and these were posted in every compartment of every train, on every line, through Hoy's work. And visiting and tourism boomed in the park as a result of that. And by something of an irony, when I was preparing this talk, I came across the fact that that one idea that he had has actually been carried forward to today. Hoy introduced a rail trip which was called Round in 9, which went from Pretoria to Lorenzo Marx as it was, and back to Pretoria by a different route, and stopped at 9 scenic spots. This was very popular, and one of the scenic spots was the Sabi Bridge over the Crocodile River. This was the bridge at the time that Hoy would have visited the park in the 1920s. As you can see, people who are clearly tourists are getting off the train, and he instituted what became by far the most attractive feature of the tour, and this was that the train parked on the bridge. All the tourists could get off and go down to the riverside, where there were big fires and a braai was held, and the rangers of the park came and entertained the tourists by stories of how they dealt with lions and damage that elephants did and anything that was outside the experience of the tourists. So this notion of parking the train on a bridge and having a stopping place where people could spend the night, because the tourists all returned to the train to sleep at night, so they didn't have to worry about wild animals while they were asleep. This has been revived in a proposed project by the railways now called the Sabi Bridge Hotel. This is an artist's impression, but the modernized version of the Crocodile River Bridge, it can be seen there, and the train will be stopped on the bridge and people will get out and go down to the edge of the water where they will be entertained by rangers from the park telling them tall stories of animal life. It's a little more luxurious than it occurred. This is one of the rooms, as an artist's impression of one of the rooms that, if this project ever happens, you will have at your disposal if you take this trip. And here is another view of the train parked on the bridge, with, as you'll notice, even the extension of a swimming pool parked on one of the struts of the railway. So an idea of Hoy's, about 95 years ago, is in fact potentially being revived even today. Hoy also became very interested in and active in electricity generating. This was not so much for its own sake or because he was very keen for people to have electric light in their houses. This was because he foresaw that in the long run, electric traction would come to replace steam. And he therefore was active in building of the first electricity station in Cape Town in 1891. And after that, he propagated the view that the state should be responsible for the provision of electricity throughout the country. Again, a complete break with the UK and US experience, where this had been a function of private enterprise, leading to many failures and inability to provide the services advertised. So Hoy tried out his first electrification in Natal. The railways at that time under Hoy was responsible for establishing what was known as the Electricity Supply Commission, small c, not ESKOM as we now have. And this was 1912, so it's about 20 years after the Cape Town one. And he established this at an area just outside Durban called Congela. And this supplied electricity to the coal mines at Dundee and Newcastle in northern Natal. And the first electric traction in South Africa was in fact the line from Dundee to Newcastle, carrying coal from the coal mines there, with electricity supplied by Eskom from this particular power station. And Hoy's participation in Eskom continued throughout his life. This is a view of him in about 1927, when, as you see, he has aged considerably, but still fairly impeccably dressed and avuncular in a way. I want to tell you why his career went as rapidly as it did. And he was involved in so many major national projects. The technology of rail revolutionized any country into which it was introduced in the early 20th century, like South Africa, for three important reasons. First of all, it reduced the costs of transportation dramatically, which meant that the head of the railways or people representing the railways needed to interact with every person in the private sector who wished to transport goods in order to work out an equitable tariff rate for them. And Sir William Hoy dealt with most of the major companies, the diamond mines and the coal mines and the gold mines in that negotiation. The second way that the railways impacted South Africa and other countries at the time was a dramatic surge in investment, especially in railways, but also in mines and other infrastructure. And Hoy was involved in several international negotiations with people bringing capital into the country. And thirdly, in almost every country, and especially in the US, for example, the spread of the railway network was associated with nation building. And one of Sir William's main preoccupations with the railway was the creation of a united South Africa held together by a properly functioning rail network. He differed drastically from the United States again in ownership of the railway. Throughout his life, he propagated the state ownership of the railway and not private ownership. He believed that with efficient officials, the state would be able to meet needs far better than the private sector simply in pursuit of profits. And the ups and downs of the railway age in the United States gave him a lot of ammunition to indicate that this view was well taken. He died, as I mentioned, in 1930 and had expressed the wish to be buried on top of the koppie, which you see in this slide. It was known then as Klipkop for reasons that are obvious from the slide, but is now known as Hoy's koppie. In fact, after his death, Lady Hoy telephoned Dani Woensdrecht from Cape Town to tell him that Sir William had expressed a wish to be buried at the top of this koppie, as it was the place where he and Dani would sit of a late afternoon and check out the fish in the bay and plan their fishing expedition for the next day. So he is buried there in 1930. This is how Ardo and Treadgold describes that. The provincial government gave its consent and the Hermanus Town Council also agreed. There was no pathway at all up the koppie at that time. In 2 days, a pathway was built up the hill. I had not told a man who was blasting the hole in the rocks for the grave just where to make it, Dani said. And I found he had made it at the exact spot where Sir William had been sitting. 27 of Sir William's fishermen friends carried the coffin in relays up the winding path to its resting place at the top. Ever since then, the koppie has been known as Hoy's koppie. Lady Hoy is buried beside him. She died in England and her body was sent out in a lead coffin, and it needed all the fishermen's strength to carry it to the top. And you see that there was a huge outpouring of grief and solidarity in Hermanus. These are flowers, if you can stretch your imagination a bit, which were placed at the top of the koppie on the actual site of his grave on the day of his burial. She was later buried beside him, and here is a view, not exactly the most recent view, but of the two graves next to each other. Unfortunately, the graves have been subject to more or less continuous vandalization. And these particular graves, the metal plaques were torn off and stolen, and some damage was done to the exterior, but not enough to warrant repairs. The metal plaques were replaced and vandalized once again. And in 2015, it happened for a third time. And I represented the History Society in supervising the repair of Hoy's grave in 2015. And there are a couple of slides I'd like to show you about that. This was the kind of damage that the vandals did. They had obviously come up the Koppie. You still have to walk up, there's no other way. And they had been carrying crowbars and had prized large blocks of granite away from the top of the grave, and obviously stole the metal plaques that were on the stage at the time. There was some concern whether they had in fact penetrated into the grave. So I spent a morning up there. First of all, we repaired the grave, about which I'll say something in a moment. And then we replaced the plaques with granite plaques, which can't be traded at the nearest scrap metal merchant and therefore have little value to vandals. So far, so good. No one's attempted to vandalize those plaques as yet. On that occasion, in order to make the repairs, we had to more or less open Hoy's grave. And so I had the privilege of looking into it to see the degree to which what was in legend about it was actually there. And there was more than was there, and I've subsequently published this information. I had assumed that the hole had been blasted big enough for the coffin, and that the coffin had then been lowered into this hole with jagged edges from the explosion, and then covered up with rocks and sandy soil from the top of the Koppie. Not so. The fishermen had gone into the hole that had been blasted and had built a rectangular brick wall, which was plastered. So they had created a space for the coffin so that it was not resting up against some jagged rocks and likely to be damaged at some point, and gone to the trouble not only of carrying up the coffin, but also carrying up bricks and mortar and water and all that was required to make those repairs. However, when we looked a little further, we found that they had also covered the coffin completely with sand from the beach, with sea sand, of approximately 6 feet in depth. One of the engineers, this gentleman, calculated that about 72 tons of sea sand would be required to fill that space. So Sir William Hoy rests in a coffin under 72 tons of sea sand and with a plastered wall around his coffin and with a granite tablet on top. Hopefully no one else is ever going to have to destroy or even to repair that. Many shots of Hermanus have been taken from Hoy's Koppie, and I wanted just to end with two of these. This is a shot from Hoy's Koppie looking east across Hermanus to the Riviera Hotel, which would be approximately there. That would be the early houses in Voelklip. These would be some houses along the Mossel River in what's now Kwaaiwater, and then these are closer to the town. And as you can see, it was a relatively undeveloped, even towards the latter part of Hoy's association with Hermanus. And someone posted on Facebook a picture taken from roughly the same spot this year. As you can see, something of a different perspective. Below here are the buildings of the primary school. There the primary school AstroTurf is. There's the Whale Coast Centre, Checkers Centre, and East Cliff stretches away there. And unfortunately, pollution, we have not escaped pollution, although it obviously isn't as bad as many other people. So the view can still be breathtaking And if you've never climbed Hoy's Kopje, I'd like to urge you to do so. Finally, Hoy was largely responsible for the buildings of Park Station in Johannesburg. Nothing to do, well, little to do with Hermanus. This is a shot of the main concourse of Johannesburg Station in 1930, the year of his death. So he didn't live to see it completed. Of course, it's been largely desecrated now and vandalized and not repaired. He was also responsible for what was known as the Blue Room, which was, in my youth and even into my 30s, was a restaurant at the station, which was quite upper class to go to. And he also commissioned from Pierneef all the painted tiles that were used to tile the Blue Room. These tiles are now in the Rupert Museum in Stellenbosch. The only one of them that doesn't celebrate a railway station is the tile that Hoy especially asked for. He asked Pierneef to paint for him as a favor the Hermanus Old Harbour, which had never been near a railway. And if you look at the tiles now in Stellenbosch, that's the only non-railway legacy which Hoy has left us. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for an excellent presentation. That was really interesting. What an amazing man, and what a contribution he made to our country. Are there any questions?
I do have one question. You said that he was the last chap to be knighted in 1919. Didn't we have a Sir de Villiers Graaf who came later?
I think that was an inherited title. He didn't actually go to London and have the monarch put a sword on his shoulder. That wasn't possible after 1924.
Yeah, how interesting.
Republican
I didn't
feeling.
know that. Fascinating. Gosh, this has been so interesting. Thank you.
I can elaborate on any point that people like to raise. There's a lot that I haven't, which I had to omit to keep it within a reasonable time.
Pat Hart here, just a little point. And then in that Blue Room in the big Park Station, that's where I had my 21st birthday. Thank you.
See, yeah, well, obviously it was a place that the high and mighty used to go.
Robin, by the time he retired, how much of the national railway network had been built?
Probably about 20,000 kilometers. I know that one figure which I have been able to find was that between 1924 and 1929, when he retired, he supervised the construction of 9,000 kilometers. I imagine the whole set was longer than that. About 20,000 kilometers, I'd guess.
And I assume the Eskom that he established in Durban was the precursor to the current Eskom.
It was indeed, yeah. It was, and there was really no thought at all of supplying electricity to people's homes. It was entirely to move railways. And it was only later that as Eskom expanded and built more power stations, it began to be possible to have electricity in your home. There were mainly municipal power stations that supplied the domestic market.
When was the Blue Train established? That was not in his time, was it?
The Blue Train was established in about 1950, because prior to that, the railways ran a service called the White Train.
Yes.
Which was the vice-regal train that only conducted the governors general from one place to another. And Hoy, when he used to often accompany Governor General, say, for instance, the Prince of Connaught, Prince Arthur of Connaught, who came to Hermanus in 1924, came here with Hoy. Hoy persuaded him to come. And he opened the golf club in its present site in 1924. There's an image, which I didn't use, of him doing this. There's also a very vigorous account in Joey Late's memoirs of Prince Arthur making an attempted seduction of an attractive local young lady in the Late's house, Skoensgezicht, which was just across the road. the Lates would always move out of their house so the Governor General and his entourage could move in. And then the dance, there was always a dance at the end of whatever official duty they'd come for. And that was held at the Marine. And Prince Arthur commanded this young lady to go over the road with him to Skoongezicht. And later she confessed that he had attempted to establish a liaison with her. But she only drank orange juice, so he didn't succeed.
Do you know whether he was involved in the construction of the railway networks in any of our neighbouring countries?
No, I haven't picked that up, but I mean, he would have in the general supervisory sense, but in the hands-on sense that I've tried to give here, he didn't, as far as I know, no. Late in life, about 1927 or so, he was seconded for a year to set up Rhodesian railways, and lived in Salisbury, as it was then, with his family for a year or so while he established the organization and the network.
Ed here. I have a question with regard to other images of the fishing catches that he had. He was obviously an avid fisherman, and the image you showed was that huge catch with some very large fish in it. And did you have other images, or are there other images of his catches that were available? Because you say he was a very keen fisherman.
Yes, Ed, there are other images. They're in the Photographic Museum here in Hermanus. This one's the one that I often use because it also includes all the important people that I want to refer to, as well as all the important fish. But I mean, by and large, Walker Bay was so stocked with fish that it was almost impossible not to catch one if you went out. And very often the gentlemen would give their fish to the hotel they were staying in, and the hotel would prepare it for dinner.
Thank you, Robin, for an excellent presentation about a very interesting man who played a very important role in our country. Thank you for all your preparation and for the research. Thank you too for everybody that joined us this morning. I'm going to close the presentation now. Goodbye.